And I'll go ahead and say hello. Um, and let's see. First, I'll say hi. So I'm James Casey, interim director of Virginia Serious Games Institute. You've probably seen me around in some form or fashion. I just want to thank everybody for coming out. We've been doing these for a few semesters now, and they've been pretty popular. We get some great folks here as speakers in a wide variety of topics. As always, if there are other topics or people that you think would be great for this speaker series, feel free to reach out. We'll put our information in the chat and things like that. But today we have a very cool treat for you. Robbie Dietrich is here to talk a little bit about the pains and perils and fun of creating games for systems that no longer exist.
So well, they still exist. There's no one sells them or makes
them. Yeah,
they
don't exist in the fact that like nobody makes these machines anymore, and the people that are doing it in very interesting and probably more complicated fashion than what we're used to in some of our other game design and development that we see out there today. But I think it's a forgotten art that I think people are going to really love. So as we do this, Robbie's going to do a talk, has some slides and stuff I think prepared. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat during, and what'll happen is Robbie can either answer them on the fly as they feel, or take them at the end, but that way at least the questions will be out there. And then at the end, we're going to have hopefully a little bit of time just for open Q&A about the topic. And then we'll wrap up and thank everybody. And then eventually the video will be put up on the web. So that's it. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming out. I'm going to shut off and shut up and turn off my camera and all that and put the spotlight on Robbie and let Robbie just take over and wow you. So that's me. Let me remove spotlight. And we'll put that on Robbie. There you go. It's all you.
Okay, cool. Thank you. As James said, welcome everyone. And I'm going to go ahead and do all that fun stuff of sharing my screen. It's going to get messy for a little bit. I'm sharing the messy screen because of reasons that will become clearer as we go along. And I'm going to have to tell this to swap around because Slides has ideas of how things want to be done, and I don't agree with them. Okay, so I've been going back and forth as to what to name this talk as I was putting together. And so like the name I've kind of fallen into now is basically creating your own physical NES game. So a Nintendo Entertainment System game in 5, not so easy, steps. So to start off things, the obligatory introduction slide. Almost all of you know who I am because a lot of you are in my classes and I've said, you have to be here. So, this is, me in one page, but probably the most relevant piece to this particular talk is me being born in 1980 and being a literal child of the 80s. That means that the first game system that I grew up with, that I played, was the Nintendo Entertainment System, and you never forget your first. So the first games I played were Super Mario Brothers and Balloon Fight. And because of that, they hold a very special, close place in my heart, especially the games of that era of the Nintendo, that first generation of games, what were often called the black box games, have a very special place in my heart. And because of that, now, as a theoretically full-blown adult, I decided to create my own homebrew Nintendo game. And so what this means is we have this grand span where we have the original Nintendo released in 1985 in the States, and then and I actually got the date wrong here on my own game, which is we have Fire and Rescue, which is my recent homebrew game, which was released in August 2021. I can't count because COVID has destroyed my understanding of years. August 2021 in digital form, that is for download on like itch.io, places like that. And in December 2021, I actually released a physical version of this game. And to give you an idea of what that looks like and what that feels like, I can enjoy the fact that there are literal now unboxing videos of my game. And I'm going to go ahead and, if I can actually find that link and put it into the appropriate place over here, I'm going to play this a bit just so you can sort of start to see what I'm talking about here, because this is the packaged product that I created. This guy doesn't move that quickly. Normally this is on double speed, but I created a game with full-on box, packaging, little extra sticker. That extra sticker is in there because the first time I printed the labels, I got the size slightly wrong. So I think, okay, well now these are, I'm just gonna throw these in as a little bonus. But I went in, made a manual box, and of course also this game cartridge itself. And this game cartridge, you can plug it into a Nintendo or any sort of Nintendo compatible system. There are a lot of really great bootleg devices out there nowadays. And this is a real working NES game. And this guy's kind of fun because he goes in and immediately like takes the cartridge apart because that's what he likes to do. And if you open up a cartridge, you can actually see that there's a whole lot of empty space in there. Like this is the entire game that we have here. This is, you know, this is the little circuit board. This is a printed circuit board, and there is the data for the game on each of those chips. Those are all like little soldering joints. Yeah, I got better as I went along. I got a lot of soldering practice in doing this, but basically the game lives here. The game I made lives on these two chips, the CHR chip and the PRG chip, and I will explain what those pieces are all about. And this game, sure enough, is a working sort of actual real Nintendo game. Let me set that to normal speed just so you can see it in its normal behavior. He's got a really funky, he has an interesting choice for filter that he's applying to this. But yeah, it's a real functioning sort of Nintendo style game. He's running it in an emulator, of course. That is a really funky choice of filter. Anyway, moving on. So that's kind of like this game that I put together recently. So let's talk a little bit about what goes into doing this. Let's explain the 5 easy steps. So step 1, we're going to make a NES game. This is a very much a high-level overview. So step 1, make a NES game. Step 2, we'll talk about how you go about acquiring the components you need to make the physical version of your game. Step 3 is about how I went about assembling them. And then step 4 is about packaging. And finally, step 5 is the final fun part of where you actually like take orders and you ship things out. And maybe if you're super, super lucky, you get to break even and possibly even make a tiny bit of profit. So let's jump into this. So step 1, the easy part, make a NES game. You know, just pop up, do that right there. No, okay. Obviously not that easy. So first of all, in order to understand this, we do need to get some idea of what the specs are for the Nintendo Entertainment System. And here's sort of the general rundown. We have this specialized CPU, which runs at a blazing 1.79 megahertz. So super, super slow. The system has an amazing 2 kilobytes of RAM, which is extraordinarily small by modern standards. I think my phone here has it's an okay phone. It has like 6 gigs of RAM, so we have roughly what, like 3 million times more memory in this device than what the original Nintendo Entertainment System has in its little head. The Nintendo Entertainment System it was actually, when the Nintendo Entertainment System came out, it was actually old tech by the time it came out. And the reason that it could essentially sort of quote unquote punch above its weight was because it had a lot of specialized hardware designed for doing the exact thing that you want a game system to do, which is like show pictures at a high refresh rate and make them scrollable and things like that. And that was accomplished using what was called the picture processing unit, which was this custom set of chips and hardware that the Nintendo Entertainment System had inside of it. And that custom picture processing unit basically defines the working restrictions that you have when you work with a Nintendo, and through that define a lot of the art style that we associate with the 8-bit era of games. Let's see, there's also 5-channel sound, which is also kind of interesting. Like you can play essentially 5 sounds at once, and that includes the music. And those channels are actually, they're fairly specific. It's actually like 2 sine wave channels, 1 triangle wave channel, 1 noise channel, and then the 5th one is the one where you play samples at like a really hugely reduced bit rate. So everything sounds like, you know, so you could get a little bit of terrible voice in there. Now, the games themselves, as you can imagine, are contained within the cartridges, but those cartridges when we looked at the inside of my cartridge there, we saw that it's just a little circuit board. Essentially what happens with like the old like Nintendo systems, when you're plugging in a cartridge, it's basically like you're plugging a new card into your computer. It's almost as if you're like taking like, you know, just like a stick of RAM, or you're taking like the GPU card in your computer and you're plugging it in each time you're playing a new game. So in a way, all the software in the Nintendo Entertainment System, that was actually like plugging in new hardware into the system. And because of that, something really interesting happens in that the hardware inside of the cartridges evolved along with the actual like data and design of the games themselves. So later games in the Nintendo Entertainment System's lifespan literally had like just technically greater capabilities because they just had more stuff on the chips. Like the actual like circuit board had like more stuff on it. There were more chips on them that allowed them to carry a lot more data, do all sorts of different things, as long as they managed to talk in the correct language to speak with the rest of the Nintendo Entertainment System. Another important idea to keep in mind is that on any given cartridge, despite all the different extra features that they may or may not contain, including stuff like battery saves and all that, at the end of the day, they always have 2 major banks of data. And that data is CHR, which is what's called character data for game graphics. And then there's PRG, that is program data, that is the code for the game. So in the picture on this slide, I have one of the classic black box style circuit boards for the Nintendo Entertainment System. And you'll notice that this circuit board looks a lot like the one that was in the video, just a different color. The person that I got circuit boards from, they basically designed their circuit boards to be almost exact copies of the Nintendo standard NROM circuit boards, almost to a like, is this totally legal kind of way? But they were just very, very close copies of that, except they were just newly manufactured. And what we have here and what became the spec for the game that I was making was the NROM spec, which is the earliest generation of circuit boards for games on the Nintendo Entertainment System. It's generally regarded as the simplest mapper. Graphics, and then on the right you have the PRG chip, which has all of the game code. Oops, let's go back one there. And in the CHR chip, you have 8 kilobytes of graphical memory. 8 kilobytes, which is not a lot. And for the program code, you have 32 kilobytes of memory, which is more, but again, not a lot. Something else that you also have on here is what's called the CIC chip. This is the chip that is used by the Nintendo to determine if it will accept this cartridge or not. In order to stop like bootlegs and to avoid the situation that happened with like the Atari that led to the infamous, console market collapse, Nintendo executed a large level of control over what games were allowed to run on the Nintendo Entertainment System. This chip was part of their solution for for doing that, because what happens is that when you put a Nintendo cartridge circuit board into a Nintendo system, an NES, it will basically like query for this chip. And if the chip doesn't send the right answer, the Nintendo just automatically resets after a few seconds. So if you ever put in a Nintendo game into an NES and it like resets every few seconds, that's because the CIC chip is either bogus or it's failing for some reason or another. One other little note is that the NROM version of the NROM mapper actually like hard coded, or not just hard coded, hard soldered, whether it would allow for scrolling vertically or allow for scrolling horizontally. That was something that you basically at the factory had to decide by either putting a dollop of solder on this pad or this pad to define what was called the mirroring mode would be for those games. This was different for later games, like the big thing for like MMC1, which was used for Legend of Zelda and Metroid, was that it allowed you, the big feature it had was that it allowed you to change your scrolling mode. So you could have like sections of like long horizontal maps in Metroid and then go to a vertical section and then go horizontal again. You could not do that on an NROM because older tech. Okay, so let's say you're sold on this. You want to try making a game for the NES. Well, how do you do that? Well, first of all, how do you write code for NES games? And you actually have a fair number of solutions available for you nowadays. Probably on like the least technically intimidating level, there are programs like NESmaker, which are kind of this editing system that is kind of like a little sort of baby game engine that will allow you to, construct a game within their framework, and it will massage all that data into the NES appropriate form. And if you put it onto a cartridge, you can run it, or you can generate a ROM and then you can run it in any Nintendo emulator that you want. The approach that I did is I wrote code directly in C because I was really comfortable with that language. And this series of tutorials from nesdug.com served as a really great guide for doing exactly that. When you're writing C code and the compiler runs and it chews on it, does all of its stuff, at the end of the day, it ends up creating assembly code. And that assembly code is specifically designed for the 6502 processor that the NES is running. And there are some people who will just write that assembly code by hand because depending on the situation, they can actually write it more efficiently than the code that would be generated by the C compiler if you were writing in C and then converting it over. Writing the assembly code directly, that's probably closest to what people did back in the day when they were writing for these, writing Nintendo games back in the 80s. In my case, I'm more comfortable with C, so I use that. I take advantage of the fact that compiler technology has gotten better, so it does produce better assembly code, more efficient assembly code than it used to. So I take advantage of that. I did write a few little pieces in hand assembly just for optimization. So all this generation of assembly, NESmaker, eventually it ends up at assembly, write in C code, it ends up assembly, or you write assembly directly. At the end of the day, it all boils down to what are called byte code. So the assembly maps directly to a series of bytes that defines the instructions that you ask a Nintendo system to run. And those instructions are things like add one number to another number, or take this value and put it in memory over here, or if look at the value of memory here, if it's bigger than this thing, jump to this other area in code. And all of the instructions that you'd ask it to do boil down to that. And you have basically like a game's code on an NES is just a long series of instructions, each of which is maybe a few bytes of data, but you have to have a lot of instructions to make a game, and all of that has to fit within 32 kilobytes, so roughly 32,000 bytes of data for your game, which you can run out of really quickly if you're not careful. One of the nice things about working on a Homebrew NES game is that the compiler, it would tell me like, hey, we are now out of space, you can't write any more code. That was a kind of a nice way to have the game tell me, have like the compiler tell me like, you know what, you should cut some features now because nothing else is going to fit. And so it actually kept me a little bit more disciplined in terms of my design. Okay, so that's the code side of it. But while you may have 32 kilobytes for code, you only have 8 kilobytes for graphics. And that is not a lot. So we're talking about 8 kilobytes of graphics, not 8K graphics. So 8 kilobytes nowadays, to give you an idea of how big that is, that's roughly the equivalent of if you had like an uncompressed image that has like RGBA, like 8 bits each for red, green, blue, and alpha, which is fairly typical. In 8 kilobytes, you could fit one image that's about 45 by 45 pixels. And that's all the graphics for a Nintendo game for the original generation. All of them fit into that. So somehow we managed to fit all the graphics into the games. How is that accomplished? So for NROM, all the graphics for a Nintendo game are actually stored as a series of 512 8x8 tiles. So all the graphics that you would be displaying on your screen are actually cut up into a series of 8x8 tiles, and there's a total of 512 of them. Half of those tiles are for what are called BG tiles, or backgrounds, and the other half of those are used for OBJs, objects, also known as sprites. Now, each of these 8x8 pixel tiles, each pixel within that is 2 bits. So 2 bits in this case means that you have, for any pixel, has the ability to have one of 4 values. It can be 0, 1, 2, or 3. And that's it. That's all the numbers that can be contained in a particular pixel. So what that means is that each 8x8 tile is 16 bytes. So if you have 16 bytes times 512 tiles, that gives you the 8,192 kilobytes, or 8K, of graphical data. Now, if each pixel can only have one of 4 colors, how do you have more than 4 colors on the screen? So the way that's done is by using a palette-based system. So all the graphics on a Nintendo Entertainment System are based on indexing into palettes. It's what's called an index color system. So basically what this means is that a given pixel in NES graphics, instead of literally having a value that says, I am red, or I am blue, or I am green, instead of that, it'll say, I have color number 1. And then there's some other data that says, okay, well, this sprite is being drawn using this palette over here, and color number 1, that happens to be a red color. Or you could switch out the palette and you'll get like a blue color instead. And the actual literal colors that you have there are just determined entirely by the palettes. And that's why in NES graphics, it's very common to have palette swaps, because with palette swaps, you keep the same pixel data. The pixel data is just saying, I use color number 1, I use color number 2, I use color number 3. And by switching out the palettes, you're changing the definition, the literal color that is associated with color 1, color 2, or color 3. And so because that's a really cheap way to do that, you had a grand proliferation of palette swaps happening in Nintendo games because it was very, very, very data efficient to do it that way. So to look at this in a more palpable fashion, I'm going to actually run my game here in an emulator so I can show you what's going on. So here's some of the code, a lot of C code, and I'm just launching the game itself into an emulator. How well is that running, by the way, for the stream? It's one that I wasn't sure, like.
It looks fine.
Running okay, you can see it, fine? Okay,
Yep, all good.
So this is Fire and Rescue, our title screen, and I'm gonna pop up a couple of extra windows using this emulator's debug functionality, and now I can show you the PPU viewer, the picture processing unit viewer, where we have this set of tiles that I was talking about. So this is the collection of 8x8 tiles that make up all the graphics in my game, Fire and Rescue. And that includes like all the lettering that would possibly show up in the game, The title logo actually takes up a fairly large amount of space because it's big and it's a lot of unique shapes. Everything else is kind of built out of all these little pieces. And half of these tiles, 256 of these tiles, they are used for background elements. And the other bank of 256 tiles is used for sprites, all the graphics that move on top of the background. And so let's see here. And also, to further illustrate this point, you'll notice in the PPU viewer over here that all these little graphics are gray. Oh gosh, when I zoom in, it actually speeds up the emulator too. That'll be funny. Okay, so when you, if you zoom in on the graphics here, you can see that all these graphics, they're all in grayscale because all they have is just really data that says this is color 1, this is color 2, this is color 3. And the reason we're able to look at them and say and have them map to actual colors is because of the palette settings that we have available here. There are 4 palettes for background elements, and there are 4 palettes for sprites. And you'll notice that the little water tank that's on the back of this character, it actually has this sort of flowing animation happening here, and that's being done entirely in the palette. If I click on this, this actually updates. So you can see that what's happening is that in the program, I'm actually changing the colors in one of the palettes, and actually 2 of them, in one of these palettes in order to cycle through various shades of blue, and those are being applied to this sprite because this sprite is using this palette, and so it has the effect of like changing colors over time, which in this case creates an illusion of a flow or a swirl, and that is classic palette animation type stuff, which you don't really get to do nowadays, and so it's really awesome to have it happen. So to further sort of illustrate what's going on here, you'll notice that we have the game, and we have parts of the game which are just only the background, so things like the timer and the HUD. This spray is actually part of the background and all that. All of this building is built out of the relatively small number of tiles that are all living up here. You'll notice most of the tiles on the BG are all that logo and all the text that's happening there. And then let's go ahead and swap these out over here. And then over here, we just have all the sprites for the game, all the interactive elements that we can place at arbitrary places on the screen. And all the data that makes up these are all living in here. And one of the interesting limitations, one of the many interesting limitations that you run into here is you do have to consider that if you want to show something on the BG, those tiles have to live inside of the BG area. If you want tiles to show up in the sprite area, they have to live in this one side of memory. And one of the things I found for this game is that I was always more constrained on BG memory. So I had to spend a lot more time being very careful about how I was using my BG memory because I was running out of it. I didn't actually have a lot of trouble with sprites. As you see here, I have a lot of extra space in my sprite memory over here. Like I could make a whole bunch of extra sprite things if I needed to for the game, but I'm kind of constrained as far as like how much variety I can add to my backgrounds because so much of it was eaten up by like the big ass title logo, things like that. Another interesting limitation to consider here is that often in a Nintendo game, probably your most limited resource is actually going to be the number of palettes you have, because you have 4 palettes available for the background, 4 palettes available for sprites. If you want to have a character that has more than like 3 colors on them, because sprite palettes are defined as having 3 colors plus the transparent color. If you want to have more than 3 colors on someone, like I did for this character, I had to construct multiple sprites and use multiple palettes for that. The main character is built out of this palette and this palette, so I could also get, their sort of flesh tone and give them like a little blue eye to go along with everything else. Background tiles, likewise, they have this interesting limitation where they are 3 colors plus 1 extra, what's defined as a background color. So there's 1 color, which is often black, but you can set it to anything. But that particular color, color 0, is actually shared across all the BG palettes. And so So other than that, all the BG palettes can have like essentially 3 colors, if you don't count the shared BG color. So you don't have a lot of color variety here per se, or you are strictly limited on how many colors you can use at once. It's a really interesting space. But I could talk forever about how to make NES games. And if you want to know more, like, talk to me anytime. I would love to share it. I'm happy to share more. But for now, we also need to talk about some of the other steps here of actually like putting this into like a physical world. So let's say you finished making your NES game. So probably me around August, finish making the game or release it here, cool. And I shot out onto Twitter like, it'd be really, I think it'd be really cool to make a physical version. I have no idea how to do that. And once I said that, I had a few people essentially like slide into my DM saying like, hey, would you like some help and advice on how to do that? I'm like a big booster for like homebrew stuff. Okay, so I talked with this person who's another hobbyist. Their day job is they're like a surgeon, but at night they like to make homebrew games, make physical games happen. So this guy like walked me through like the whole process, like where I can acquire various components and whatnot. And I'll give you sort of like the TLDR version of it. So here is what my shopping list essentially looked like. So the first big components I got were these series of tools, getting an EEPROM programmer, a universal programmer as it's sometimes called. And that's like about $100 on Amazon. Getting a soldering kit, a cheap soldering kit is about $40. Because I really wanted to make my packaging be authentic to the original Nintendo Entertainment System style. I needed to have like these very specifically sized blocks of styrofoam. So I had to get like a styrofoam cutter, just like a hot wire that you can run through styrofoam. It makes your house super stinky when you use it. That was really, really fun. You can get security bit drivers. Most of the screws on the back of Nintendo games use this particular type of screw, which you don't find in like Lowe's or anywhere like that. It's very sort of specific for like, computer type stuff. But you can find, if you do a search for a security bit driver, you can get the screwdriver with the right kind of head. It's relatively cheap. They have them if you go to eStarland, they actually have these screwdrivers there, just like right next to the cash register. So if you're like buying a game and you're like, I need a new screwdriver for this, like just go over there and get them. And these are tools that I can just use for whenever I am doing this kind of Nintendo stuff now. The consumable items are perhaps more interesting. So here's the list of consumable items I have here. I have the shells, which are the actual cartridges, the physical cartridges that you see as a human being, the big plastic shells. Those ran about $2 each. Then I had all of my printed circuit boards, the NROM 256s, with the lockout chip installed. And I got both the shells and the PCBs, the printed circuit boards, from this place called Second Dimension. Like this was a recommendation, like, yeah, talk to Adam at Second Dimension. And yeah, he was really nice. And he actually gave me a really good deal because I ordered like 150 of these things all at once. And that's really cool. And I'm really happy to say that he also did a Kickstarter recently where he's funded making, he's making like a Genesis RPG, which is super cool. And it actually got funded. So good job, Adam. Then there are a bunch of miscellaneous components, like getting like little capacitors that go in there. These are common electronic components. I could find them on Amazon for like 32 cents each. The EEPROM chips, the actual chips that contain the data, the CHR, the PRG stuff, those were a little harder. I found the best deals for them were actually just on eBay because a lot of these chips, they're not actually manufactured anymore, but they were manufactured in such huge numbers that you can get them for really cheap if you find the right spot. Boxes were actually fairly expensive to produce. So I went out, I designed boxes, designed manuals and all that, and went to like shopped around for like custom printing services to see a place I could get like the right size and the right thickness of the box. Getting the thickness of the box turned out to be kind of a thing. Like I got a sample once from one place, but it's just like, oh, it's too thin. It's gonna like bend too much. So I had to like search around to find the right thickness for it. Those materials, the packaging, that costs, as you can see here, the costs are actually relatively significant relative to all the electronic parts, which you would think would be the really expensive parts. Then there's a few etc. bits. I got like, lots of extra security screws and vinyl box protectors for all the boxes. So I send it off to someone. The box doesn't get damaged, stuff like that. But yeah, that was my big shopping list. I have a good old Excel sheet with all these prices that I was gathering for myself. And yeah, here's some pictures of the things when they came back, when they started arriving at my place, like this giant box of shells and printed circuit boards. These are sleeves of UV EEPROM chips that I got from eBay. And then of course, there's like the big old box of just like, here are newly printed manuals and all that fun stuff. Like, this is a fun time. As I was like getting these things showing up at my house, it took a few months to gather all the pieces. But once I had them all gathered, then I could actually get into assembling them. So how do you actually put these things together? So when you have made a homebrew NES game, when you've done all the programming, what you have at the end of the day is a ROM file. This is the same kind of file that if you go to certain reputable and or disreputable parts of the internet, you can get ROMs of all of your favorite Nintendo games and everything else like that. And you are basically making the same kind of thing. You are making a ROM. And as a ROM, it works in any emulator, as you saw earlier in this talk, and you can do all the Nintendo things to them. One of the other Nintendo things you can do with these things is you can take a ROM file and using certain programs, you can split it out into its component PRG and CHR pieces. And this basically like breaks the ROM file into two separate files. And then each of those files, you burn them onto one of the chips using the universal programmer. And the hardest part here is one, to be patient as you're putting these things in one by one and clicking a button says like, okay, burn that in, cool, it worked. Burn that in, cool, it worked. Burn that in, oh, it failed. I'm gonna put this someplace so I don't get it mixed up. And then you have to make sure to like label these things because they're just gonna be a bunch of identical chips. So you'll notice here I put a little bit of tape on top of each one to label them either as CHR or PRG. I usually would just like sit down for like, okay, next 20 minutes, this is my life. And I'll take like a couple sleeves of chips and just start like kind of burning them slowly, slowly. They take about 20 seconds each or something. But it's not a bad evening. It makes the coffee taste better. And yeah, the other fun little bit here, a little bit of trivia. The other reason for putting tape on them is that these are actually, what I was using were what are called UV EEPROM chips, which are like, even for like this kind of chip, they're sort of the older version. And I got them because they're cheaper. But they actually have this like little window up top, and that window allows you to erase them if you put them under strong UV light for like 30 minutes or something. You can erase the data. So just to make sure that data was never corrupted by like stray sunlight getting on them, it takes a lot of direct sunlight to do that. But in order to prevent corruption, I always made sure to like tape them up so they wouldn't get like too much sun or things like that. I thought that was a really fun thing. I eventually did get like a UV eraser, which is just like, it's like the same kind of UV light you use to like clean like your toothbrush or something. You just kind of put these chips into a drawer and then you crank a timer and then it shines a UV light bulb on them for a while. It's really fun tech, actually. Okay, so at this point, I burn data onto the CHR and PRG chips. What do I do next? Well, then I take them and I go to my little circuit board and I plug it in there, kind of have to work each of the little feet of the chip into the various holes, do that for char, do that for PRG, kind of poke my fingers a lot because I'm clumsy. And then I also take like the capacitor, which is just like a little ceramic disc with two wires sticking out of it, kind of bend them out, slip them into some holes inside of the right-hand side of the PCB, of the printed circuit board, and then it's all in there. Getting the ordering right is really important for this. The first time I did this, I actually put the CHR chip and the PRG chip in backwards, which is not good. I didn't desolder that and try to fix it. I kept that around as like a little reminder to myself to double check when I'm doing these things. I finished up, I soldered the whole thing. I'm like, all right, ready to test this out. Then I looked down like, wait a minute. So it pays to be picky and careful as you do this sort of thing. Let's see, placing the capacitor and having slotted all the components in there. So at this point in this picture, all the pieces are kind of slotted in. They're kind of held in by tension because you have these like little metal legs in the chips, you push them through the holes and they can kind of bend them outwards. So the tension of that holds them into the chip. But to make sure that they never fall out again, that's when you go in and you start soldering things. So I have like my little soldering setup of having like a little helping hand that I clip I clip the boards into, and then I take a soldering iron, which is you take a little bit of this sort of wire that you're kind of melting into each of these little joints. And essentially, like solder is it's basically like glue that conducts for the most part. It's like conductive wax in a way, made of metal. And you're just sort of heating up these little holes and then like melting this little strip of stuff in there. And it's sort of painstaking work. And you know, for this particular project, I had to do it for a lot for each game. So each chip has like 28 little joints that I need to solder, and there are 2 chips on each circuit board. So that's like 56 joints right there. There's 2 more for the capacitor. And then there is that pad on the front that I have to jump. And so that's 1 more soldering joint. So in total, I had like 59 joints to solder per cartridge. So by my calculations, I've now soldered joints about like 3,500 times over the course of this project. And when you do that, like you get a lot of practice. And I definitely got faster as I went along. Like when I was first doing it, it took like 40 minutes to do 1 cartridge. Now I can probably do one in maybe like 10, 15 minutes, depending if I'm on a roll. So yeah, you get all the pieces soldered in, you slot it into the shell, you tie it with, you screw it tight with the little security bits, and then you test it out. And you test it out by first putting it into your Nintendo. First thing you do, you have to program the CIC. That is, you stick it into the Nintendo and then you kind of hit reset until the Nintendo now acknowledges the CIC chip that's in there. And having done that, if everything's gone well, you have a working version of your game. You always have to make sure to test your game when you do this, because there are several points of failure, like just like kind of like bad soldering here and there could cause like some of the connections to not connect, and then your game will break. Thankfully, it tends to break in fairly obvious ways, like it'll just not run or the graphics will all be corrupted. And so you don't have to play like super deep into the game to figure out if it's working. Like if it's going to break, it's going to be broken in a really obvious way, but you do want to test every single thing. In my process, once I tested them, that's when I applied the label and I'm like, yes, we've got a winner. This is going out to a happy customer in the world. And so that leads us into packaging. So this is the unboxing, where you put stuff into the little boxes. As I mentioned earlier, the packaging can be surprisingly expensive. Part of, you know, for better or for worse, the choices that I made for the packaging for this game, they set me on a particular course that I couldn't always negotiate myself out of, because I wanted it to match the style of the original NES game. So there are certain places where I had to make more expensive choices because I was trying to make the packaging fit this sort of archaic spec. And nowadays, some people have like really creative approaches for packaging where they'll put games into like clamshells and all sorts of other cool stuff. And depending on where they're sourcing, they can actually make their packaging super cheap, but still be like cool and funky, but it won't look authentic. And so I was aiming for the authentic part. Probably the favorite compliment that I've gotten from people who played this game or who've gotten the box version of this game is that they told me that like it smells like a real Nintendo game. Like when I opened the box, I took the cartridge out, it had that smell, and I hadn't smelled that in like 20 years. And that was like, I had like at least 2 people tell me that. I'm just like, oh, yes, you know, like they got it. That was the exact thing I was aiming for. So assuming that you've made all this fun stuff, each of these boxes has that little piece of styrofoam. Assuming you've made this, you are ready to go off and ship it. And in this case, shipping the game is literal, because I did actually do a little bit of, you know, like baby e-commerce type stuff where I sold copies of my game directly off of my own website. And I basically put together this storefront using in this case, some software called Snipcart. And Snipcart allowed me to tie into both PayPal and Stripe as payment providers. So Snipcart is, you know, just one of those many like web-based services that you sign up for, and if you actually make money on them, you owe them a little bit of money. And so I integrated them into my website along with like Stripe and PayPal, and that allows people to actually order these games directly from my website. In total, the Snipcart and then Stripe and all that, they take roughly about in total 6% off of each in terms of like the fees that they charge me, which is not bad. It's cheaper than doing stuff on like say Etsy or eBay. Although I am looking into maybe I'm going to be setting up an Etsy shop or something like that to, also provide this game in places that other people might feel more comfortable going to and shopping from than just like some weirdo's website. So in the process of doing this, I've actually implemented essentially just-in-time assembly of games and shipping directly from my home. I've been using FedEx and USPS, and I just sort of experimented. So like, I hope this works. And I said, I'll ship worldwide. And so far it's worked. Like I've sent my game out to Japan. I've sent it off to Germany. There's some folks in the Netherlands and then various places in the States. And so far, so good. I was actually, one of the things that you can do with like FedEx, USPS, also UPS as well, is that you can create accounts with them, and they'll give you keys that you can then plug into these like account API keys that you can plug into Snipcart. And then in Snipcart's UI, it'll actually query their servers to get fully accurate like shipping prices, which is really cool and makes you feel like, super cool person. Yeah. And also I do also like sell the game like in a fully digital version on itch.io, and that's also been a whole other thing. It's worked out pretty well. So yeah, that is a blazing speed run through talking about releasing a NES game. If you want to like ask me more about it later, or actually ask me more about it now, you are fully welcome to do so. I've been totally ignoring the chat, not because I think you should be ignored, but because I only have so much bandwidth. I guess we go into the chat. Is that the idea? I'm gonna stop sharing.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead and you can take down your. Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
Yeah.
So I was monitoring the chat. It was a lot of just commentary. Like the whole idea of like kilobytes versus megabytes, gigabytes. I was like, geez, I remember all those. But and there was one question that Michael had during that when you were talking about like the difference between BG and sprites. The background of the sprites is. What is the reasoning for why you couldn't use some of the sprite space and you had to fit everything into BG? Like, why can't you move some of the logo or other little elements over there? And I'm sure there's coding thing, but that was the question Michael posed.
Yeah,
if you want to answer that.
That's actually a really great question. So the world separation between like BG and sprite, that's very much just like it's what the hardware requires you to do. And so those essentially they live in separate areas. And the interesting thing is that's the hardware requirement. But you can make things out of say sprites that look like they're part of the BG. That look to you as like a person, like they're part of the background, but you can then use sprites to sort of fill them out. And actually for some parts of the game, I actually did that for like parts of the HUD. So when I was, actually let me bring up the game again to illustrate that. If I can find the right folder, mind you, there are parts of the HUD that I constructed them out of sprites instead of BG because I was running out of tiles, and for that particular application that works. Now, the big limitation that you run into with sprites, and this is probably one of the most infamous limitations, is that on NES, you can't have more than 8 sprites on a single scan line. So that means one horizontal line can't have more than 8 sprites showing up on it. If there is more than 8 sprites there, that last sprite will disappear. This is why a lot of Nintendo games, if you look at them, if too many things get on the same horizontal line, some of them will start flickering. And that flickering is actually because, and Fire and Rescue does this as well, is because you actually, a lot of games, they've kind of like, just like every other frame, they swap the order of when they render things. Like they'll render enemies before players in some cases, and then in other cases, they'll render player before enemies. So that way, if the player gets in the same line with a bunch of enemies, all of those items will flicker. If you don't do that, what will happen is that whatever is furthest right on the screen just straight up disappears, and you just don't see it anymore. So let's see here. So yeah, let me see if I can illustrate that thing I was talking about. So there's parts where on the BG, I'm not sharing my screen because I'm a dummy. I know how things work. I know logic. Okay, so you can see this. Yes, you can. So in this particular screen here, all these background elements, I actually make part of them using the sprites, and that was for a couple of reasons. I make sprites here because I had budget for doing some more sprites. There's also a maximum number of sprites you can have on the screen at any given time as well. So I had enough budget to make those in sprites, and that way I could also use BG tile, use the sprite tiles instead of the BG tiles for them. But it is for like very kind of like specific cases that you do that. One of the more infamous things that a lot of Nintendo games do in order to kind of break the assumptions about what is sprite and what is BG is that whenever you had like a screen filling boss, and that is a boss that would be like too expensive in terms of sprites to actually create just out of sprites, a lot of times what they'll do is that they'll have like a big background element, and they'll kind of make like all the background black so you can just use all the BG tiles for like this big hunking boss. And then in order to make it look like it's moving around, they'll scroll the background behind you, which makes it feel like it's like a big dude, tread dude or something, or giant floating brain moving around. But then, like they'll maybe like animate little pieces of them as sprites to make them look like more dynamic and alive. But if you look carefully, it's just it's just like a big static image that's just moving back and forth. So yeah.
Wow. Okay. Let's see. We also had a question from Nathan. What are some of the coding tricks that you can do to decrease the code file size? Like, how do you get it down to fit in that such a small limit as you're struggling to write all those cool things that your game are doing?
Oh, that one, that's a special, like, and very like platform specific nightmare sometimes. So one of the things I found, well, first of all, you have to have a measurement system put together. Like you have to like be tracking file sizes or have like a script that will like read out file sizes for you and tell them what, or read the code size for you and tell you what it is. Because the changes that you have to do in order to optimize this are not always intuitive. And it's, unless you've worked with it a lot, it's hard to predict when certain behaviors will just produce more instructions than you would expect. One of the common places that you deal with this is that in doing stuff with like parameters and functions, which seems like it should be like, oh, that's cheap and free. It's like not on a Nintendo, because it doesn't really have the same kind of stack that we're used to. Just having parameters and functions creates like a whole extra set of like instructions and jumps and reads and writes that A, slow down your code, but B, also like increase the code size. So a lot of times you will actually like avoid putting parameters and functions by just using lots of global variables, which is like you're going to do the things that all the programming teachers tell you that you should not do. And they're right, you probably shouldn't overuse global variables. But in the Nintendo world, it makes such a difference in terms of code size to do so that you end up doing it. There's other places of like, other cool things like the Nintendo, it doesn't actually really do multiplication per se. Like you can, in the code, you can write stuff that involves multiplication, but the multiplication is going to actually be made up of a series of what are called bit shifts instead of like literal like multiplication. There's no like floating point graphics process or anything on there. And so if you're just multiplying by some wacky number like 13, it'll actually create a whole bunch of instructions because it's trying to like break that down into a series of bit shifts that will give you the number that you're looking for, like a series of bit shifts and additions to create the number you're looking for. But if you multiply instead by a power of 2, you'll get like you can do that in like 1 or 2 instructions instead. And so it's like there's all these like little places where it makes a huge difference. Indexing arrays with like and doing like additions in line inside the indexing also like blows up your code size for reasons that I don't remember. Yeah, there's lots of little things, super specific.
Awesome. Tony had a question about a different aspect of it, and that was, what about FedEx or U.S. Postal Service? Like, what differences? Like, when would you use one over the other? Obviously, one's probably more expensive depending on the use case and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, why'd you use both, and what situations made sense for various
All right.
situations?
Yeah, so the reason I use both, so actually my original intention was like, I'll just put like USPS, FedEx, and UPS all on there. And my reason for that is like, oh, it's a customer choice. Let them go with it. But I eventually dropped UPS because it was like always more expensive than FedEx. But here's the thing that I figured out is, first of all, if you talk with the FedEx people, they will give you discounts very quickly. If you say like, oh, I'm a business, I'm doing this. And so when I'm using like my FedEx account, the prices that I can ship at are 40% lower than the standard retail price and whatnot. So that brings it real close to USPS, but not all the way there. A lot of times I kind of leave it out as just sort of up to choice for my customers, and most people use USPS. But there are a few people who use FedEx, and it seems to work for the most part.
Awesome.
Yeah, I did have some cases where USPS every once in a while it's tracking like the API that you use to get prices that breaks down, and then when that happens on Snipcart, like USPS just like disappears as a shipping option. So I had some cases where at one point someone's like, "There's like no shipping options." I'm like, wait, no, huh? It's like, do you just not ship to this country? I'm like, no. You're England. Yes, of course I should. What's going on? And I found out that was what was going on. So I did actually like hard code in like a fallback USPS one for like the most common option, just so that one doesn't disappear.
All right, so we have one last question I asked to make sure there was one. And so this is the question that we're going to end with. How do you think your game cartridge ended up smelling authentic, like an old NES game?
That's a great question. I actually have a theory on this. Like I thought about this one for a while because this was like a happy accident. But one of the things that I did when I was doing this, like I found myself going down a weird rabbit hole where I ended up looking for videos of people like unboxing factory sealed NES games, because I wanted to get like all the little details right, like the orientation of the plastic bag, whether it opens towards the top or towards the bottom, whether the sleeve around cartridges has this like little sort of angular thing, whether that angle points to the right or points to the left. I wanted to get all those little details right. And I was taking notes like, oh, okay, so the manual goes inside of the plastic bag and everything. And I think that Nintendo smell was the smell of the manual, which because I put the manual inside of the bag, but the cartridge and everything, it's just sitting there kind of like licking its sort of like inky smell into that bag. And so it's kind of like permeating that. So when the moment someone like actually like goes in, they open the bag, like there's this waft of, printed ink smell coming out there. And I think that's the smell. That it's just a theory, a game theory, but I think that's what happened there. And when I first got the manuals, I did actually go in and do a whole sort of like, I remember that, so I think that's what happened.
That's awesome. That's a good last question to end on. I think that's very nice. It was very entertaining, very interesting, I think, and I hope everybody agrees. And I hope everybody thanks you for your time. That was an awesome talk. It will be recorded, so if you want to share it with folks, it will be up on the Speaker Series website sometime this week, as soon as I get it up on YouTube and share it and all that type of stuff. And then the next one will be on March 9th. Orrin Adcox will be talking about his thesis from the grad program on the evolving nature of game mechanics. So feel free to come back and tune in and invite other folks. And again, if you have other thoughts or people you want to come and talk to folks here, we're always open to it. So thank you, everybody, and especially thanks, Robbie, for the great talk. And we'll see you guys next time.
All right. Thank
Bye,
you all.
everybody.
It was a lot of fun. If you ever have any extra questions, just like ask me anytime. You know where I live.
All right. Go ahead and stop the recording.